This is about the last caretaker. She was the caretaker here from 1941 to 1984. And there's so much to the story. I've really had to edit it, but I think the essence of it will still come across. Her name is on that little monument right there. And you will see, it looks like Suye. She was born in Japan. It looks like Suye, but it's pronounced Ca. And the truth is, I don't know if this was the name given her by her parents. As I understand it, Ca, or Suye, actually means the youngest, the littlest, and she was the baby of the family. So maybe it was kind of a nickname, a term of endearment. I'm not sure, but that is the name everybody around here knew her by, Ca. Now, to explain how she got here, I have to begin with a name that's going to come into the story and then leave it very quickly. So let me do that. I'm beginning with a person named Adeline Kelsey. She was from Oneida County, New York, out near Utica. And in 1875, she did something really amazing. She became a doctor, not a nurse, a doctor. Adeline Kelsey got her medical degree 1875, and a few years later, I want to make sure I give credit where credit is due, the Presbyterian Missionary Board hired her to go to China as a medical missionary to help cure people's illnesses and to try to bring them to Christianity, a medical missionary. Adeline Kelsey, Dr. Kelsey, was in China for a few years. Health concerns undermined her. She came back to the States, regained her health, and then the Women's Missionary Society sent her to Japan as a medical missionary. This was in the year 1885, and she established a clinic, the American Mission Home near Yokohama. Among the many things Dr. Kelsey did is, as she got to know Japanese people, she assessed, especially the women, I think exclusively the women, trying to figure out who among them might make good doctors. Japanese-speaking medical people would be obviously very useful. And she found many. The ones I'm going to focus on were Miss Hannah Abe and Miss Kuko Sudo. It's Miss Sudo especially we're going to follow a little bit. Dr. Kelsey brought them to the States, these two women. She and the Missionary Society subsidized their training as doctors. And indeed, they were able to return to Japan with Dr. Kelsey and open a new hospital, the Yokohama Charity Hospital. So we have Dr. Kelsey, Dr. Abe, and Dr. Sudo. Doctors Abe and Sudo had converted to Christianity. Dr. Sudo's sister was named Mayu, M-A-Y-U, and she married a Mr. Narita. I know you're not going to remember all these names. The point is that we get to the Narita family, Ca Narita, we get to the Narita family through Dr. Sudo. That's really the point. The Naritas were exposed to the Dr. Kelsey's education about Christianity, and they too converted. And I think they probably were not well received by their neighbors because they had become Christians. In any case, Dr. Kelsey sponsored the Narita family's move from Japan to the United States. The whole family. Now, they didn't come over as a unit. The first of the family to come over was Mr. Narita and the family's one son, Koichi. They came over together, and their stories of discovering America are just, I could go on 20, 30 minutes about that. Coming to upstate New York, they passed through North Dakota, and their train got caught in a blizzard and stopped. The snow just overwhelmed the whole train. They couldn't move forward or backward, and it looked like they were going to starve to death. They didn't. But remarkable story. These people from Japan, I doubt had ever seen weather like that. And if I was a potential new immigrant, I might have just turned around right there after the blizzard. But they came to upstate New York, where Dr. Kelsey lived. She had a farm out near Utica, in what's a little town now called Westdale. They liked what they saw, Koichi and his son. I'm sorry, Mr. Narita and Koichi. And they sent for the rest of the family, Mrs. Narita and all the daughters. All right. The rest of the family arrives in Seattle. They're being processed through immigration. And they're all processed through except Mrs. Narita. She has an eye condition of some sort. Trachoma, I think it was called. They would not let her into the country. They said, she's got to go back to Japan. Well, the youngest child, Ca, at this point I think was just a toddler. So she went back to Japan with her mom. And I think Mr. Narita expected that his wife would recover eventually and would return with Ca to the States. That didn't work out because Mrs. Narita, there are two versions of it. Either she developed cancer or had an asthmatic condition that just overwhelmed her. In any case, Mrs. Narita died. So here you have a 6-year-old girl, Ca. Her family is in America. Her mom has just died. What are you going to do? Well, she's got to come back to the States for sure. And I found the ship on which this little girl sailed in 1907. It was the Ryojun Maru into Seattle. And the manifest says that this little girl, her chaperones were Dr. Kelsey and Dr. Abe. And she wasn't the only child. There were two other Japanese children with her. Their last names were Sudo. So the Sudos and the Naritas were kin. There's just no doubt about it. In any case, Ca is reunited with her family in Westdale at Dr. Kelsey's farm. The children are Maya, Koichi, the son, Jean, and Ren, and Ca, of course, the youngest. What's going to happen is, on the farm, they will be tutored in English and American history and society. Dr. Kelsey will see to that. The kids will go to the local school. It's almost like a communal enterprise. They will help on the farm. They're not slave labor. It's really like a commune. But the Missionary Aid Society and Dr. Kelsey will see to the kids' educations. And these kids are going to turn out to be really smart. The whole family turns out to be brilliant. Now, I want to tell you what happened to Ca's siblings, and then I'll get back to her story. Maya Narita became a public health nurse in Pine Mountain, Kentucky, of all places. And she would go on mule or donkey back into Appalachia, down into the hollers, to help the hillbillies with their health. And you talk about a role reversal. Dr. Kelsey had gone to Japan. A Caucasian woman helping Asian people. And here was a Japanese lady, Maya, helping American hillbillies with their health. But yes, that was the career she chose, and she was good at it. And after her stint in Appalachia, she worked in a hospital in Philadelphia, and unfortunately had to have her gallbladder removed, and the surgery went wrong, and she died in 1928, Maya. Koichi Narita, the son, would ultimately move to Mount Clemens, not far from Detroit. And he would marry and have two sons, Wesley and Lowell, and I will talk about them in due course. Jean was educated by an institution in New York City called the Froebel Society. They were an educational institution, and they hated the straitjacket of American education, where facts are fed in and the kids spit them back out. They wanted to, their definition of education was, you help the whole child. Yes, intellectually, but also emotionally, creatively. And she learned their method of education. Jean will move to San Francisco, where she will become a kindergarten teacher. And in her spare time, she will work with immigrants from Japan, helping them to learn English. And in 1926, she marries one of her students, Theodore Kenzo. I'm sorry, that was Wren I was talking about, Froebel Society. She goes to San Francisco. She marries Mr. Ogasawara. Full name was actually Kenzo Ogasawara, but he went by the name of Theodore. Okay, that's Wren. They're going to have two daughters, Frances and Nancy. Jean, let me get back to Jean. Jean's going to marry a gentleman named Yoshida, Gengoro Yoshida. And they will live in Florida. And they will have two sons, Jun and Kenjiro. So, you got the family scattered around America. Maya has passed away, but she was in Kentucky. Koichi is in Michigan. Jean is in Florida. Wren is in San Francisco. They are all over the place. Now, how did Wren wind up here at Grant Cottage? Well, she comes to America, 6 years old. She's with the rest of the family, Dr. Kelsey's place in Westdale. And things are going fine. She's going to school. She's smart as a whip. But at age 13, she suddenly is diagnosed with tuberculosis. As it happens, the same year she was diagnosed, a TB sanitarium had opened here on Mount McGregor. And Dr. Kelsey pulled some strings and got 13-year-old Suye admitted as a patient at the TB sanitarium. Needless to say, while Suye was a patient, she wanted to come to the cottage to meet the couple that ran this place because, well, the first caretaker is Oliver Clark, Union veteran, former POW, survivor of Andersonville. He is married to Dr. Kelsey's sister, Martha, and all these family connections. So, CA, of course, wants to meet the sister of Dr. Kelsey. So she comes down here and she meets Martha and she meets the old veteran. And they don't have any kids. And her family, her Japanese family, is just out of reach. So she begins to bond with this couple. as surrogate parents, they really do form almost a parent-child relationship. It will take CA something like 6 to 8 years to finally recover from TB, to be cured. And now she's 18, and she can go anywhere in America where her siblings are. They all would love to have her come and join them. By this time, Oliver, the Civil War veteran, has passed away. And the caretaker here is Martha, his widow. And Martha loves CA as her daughter. And Martha asks, would you like to stay here with me? And CA jumps at the chance. She said, yes, I would. So Ca Narita is going to move in here and, like Martha, live upstairs where the caretakers lived. And she will learn, Ca will learn at Martha's feet everything there is to know about Ulysses S. Grant, his history, Grant Cottage. Now, I have to say that all the Naritas were very devoted Christians. Ca especially. When she was at the sanitarium, she would lead church services when she could. She visited all the churches in the area. She played the piano and the organ, I think, and got invited when she was a little older to be the pianist at many churches in the area. Everybody got to know her in this area, and they fell in love with her. Her English became impeccable. I have seen letters that Ca Narita wrote. The English is beyond anything I could write, for sure, and I grew up as an English speaker. So Ca, in her own way, was brilliant. All right. In the 1930s, you gotta remember, she didn't come through Ellis Island. Nobody gave her papers. She is not officially an American citizen, and she wants to be. In the 1930s, there are immigration laws forbidding immigrants to come in from China and Japan and places in the Far East. The only way that can happen is if, as an individual, the would-be immigrant goes to Washington to testify before a House committee about why she should be granted citizenship. It's on a one-to-one basis. So Ca Narita, in the 1930s, goes to Washington and testifies in front of this committee. And there are lots of people supporting her application for citizenship. All the staff at the sanitarium, all the doctors and nurses. Ca, even though she now lives here, is now the editor of the institution's newsletter, the Mount McGregor Optimist, it's called. I have pictures on a table back there of Ca at different points in her life, and the cover of one of the Mount McGregor Optimists that she was editor of. So all the medical team vouch for her. All the church people vouch for her before this congressional committee. The American Legion vouches for her because of her patriotic devotion to the Ulysses S. Grant story. And in the 1930s, there are in this area a small handful of Civil War veterans still alive. And they write vouching for her. Her case is going to be covered by the New York Times. This is where I get this information. They'll describe her wardrobe as she testifies before the committee. I know she wore a pillbox hat, but I don't remember the rest. And it goes well. Until one of the congressmen says, and I'm paraphrasing, but only a little bit, Basically what he says is this: Miss Narita, it is clear you are a good person. Everyone speaks very well of you. I can see why they would like you to become an American citizen. But you know, if we do that, we'll be setting a precedent. And other Japanese immigrants who are not as nice as you are might want to take advantage of that. So no, we reject your application. They would not let her become an American citizen. She comes back to Grant Cottage and carries on being Martha's assistant here. Ca will walk down the path through the woods every morning. It's about 100 yards. The woods open up down here, and you're on this, what we call the overlook, and there's a flagpole there. And Ca will raise the American flag every morning and bring it down every evening. In her head, she is an American. And around here, everybody thinks so too. Martha dies in the summer of 1941, and Ca becomes the Grant Cottage caretaker. This is not a great year to be a Japanese person in America because, as you know, in December 1941, the Empire of Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. And the government begins rounding up people of Japanese ancestry and interning them. The FBI comes to Grant Cottage and they say, Miss Narita, you are not an American citizen. You are an enemy alien. They go up to her bedroom and they ransack the place. They flip over the mattress of her bed. They look through her clothes, all the dresser drawers. They're looking for subversive documents, and they find none. They confiscate her radio. It's not a shortwave radio. She is not communicating with Japanese submarines in the Hudson River. It's just an ordinary radio, but they take it away. And it looks like they're going to send her to one of those camps. Well, those who vouched for her in the 1930s rally round again, and they beg the government not to send her to one of the camps. And ultimately, these petitions work. The government says there's no getting around the fact that Miss Narita is an enemy alien. However, we will not send her to the camps. But what we must do is place her under house arrest at Grant Cottage for the duration of the war. Which meant that to leave the mountain to go shopping in Saratoga, Ca had to get a military panel to approve her shopping trip and issue a document. It also meant that she might become a target. Now, she was really loved by the staff at the sanitarium. And one of the doctors, Dr. Ordway, came to her and said, you might be in danger. If you don't mind, what I would like to do is to install an emergency buzzer. If something starts happening here at the cottage, you hit that button, it'll ring at our security office, and the security people will be here to help you in an instant. Ca would write a letter about this to a friend, and I've seen a copy of it. She said it had never occurred to her that she might be in danger. It had never crossed her mind. That's how she was. The buzzer was installed. She was not harassed, as it turned out, but this is an indication of how much she meant to the folks at the sanitarium. So during the war, she continues to do tours. She answers letters to come here about General Grant. She still raises and lowers the flag down there on the overlook. And things are going okay under the circumstances. Circumstances are about to change. Her cousin Ren, Ogasawara, lives in San Francisco, and her family is rounded up and sent to the Gila Bend internment camp in Arizona. Mr. Ogasawara is really disliked by the camp authorities. He's a journalist. He knows about the Constitution. He actually starts a in-house publication at Gila Bend on behalf of the prisoners. And in his little newsletter, he's always talking about civil rights. And the camp authorities do not like him at all. All right. Ren dies of cancer at Gila Bend. Ren has two daughters, Frances and Nancy. Their age is about 16, 18. They're teenagers in any case. The camp authorities are going to keep their dad. But they say, if someone on the outside will take responsibility for these little girls, we'll let them out. And Suye says, they're my nieces, send them to me. And so the camp authorities let the girls out, and they come here to Mount McGregor, and they will live here with their aunt, Ca. They will go to high school down in Saratoga. I did a tour some years ago, and this elderly gentleman said, now I had time to tell this story, and he said, wait a minute, you're saying Nancy was in an internment camp? And I said, yeah, that's right, her mom died there. He said, I never knew that. I was in Nancy's class, and at the end of school, she'd always come back to Mount McGregor, and there was an adult woman up there on the mountain who I knew was Japanese. I just assumed was her mother. I had no idea her real mother had died in an internment camp. I didn't know that. Nancy never told anybody about that. All right. About Nancy and Frances. Nancy, well, even after the war, when all the restrictions were lifted, and Nancy and Frances were adults, they would come back here every summer. And they had good memories about Grant Cottage and their aunt. And Nancy actually got married locally, and her wedding reception was here at the cottage. Just a couple things about Frances and Nancy. First about Nancy, the younger sister. Now remember, she'd been in an internment camp, and her mom had died in horrifying circumstances. You'd think she'd be really traumatized, and I actually think she was. But she would go to Bowling Green State University in Ohio and graduate in 1952. And she will get married later in 1957. Eventually moved to Virginia Beach, Virginia, and now has several grandchildren. Frances, the older of the sisters, went to Wellesley and graduated. Then she went to Yale and graduated. She worked for the American Lung Association for 36 years and eventually moved to Asheville, North Carolina. Frances, I know, is still living because she visited Grant Cottage 2 months ago at age 93. Back on the table where I have historic pictures, there is on an iPad a photograph one of our friends of Grant Cottage took of Frances when she was upstairs looking at the old rooms where she and her sister used to live. She's still alive. And I'm going to mention something in a bit. Tells you she's still with it and she's still feisty. Frances. All right. the war ends. Now, I'm going to tell you, just in passing right now, I'll get into details in a minute. All of Ca's nephews wanted to enlist in the American Army, but were turned down because they were Japanese American. Until the government realized they needed more manpower and finally authorized one regiment of Japanese American boys. And all of Ca's nephews enlisted. I'm going to tell their stories in time, in a few minutes. But for now, I'll say the war ends. And Ca has been through a lot. She has been under house arrest here. She has raised two little girls whose mother died in an internment camp, and these two little girls, their dad was not let out. They essentially were orphaned, and they were traumatized. Ca, one of her nephews, fighting the Nazis in Europe, killed in action. I'm going to talk about him. She's been through a lot, and you would think that her eagerness to become an American citizen might have been dampened a little bit. Not so. Immigration laws are liberalized, and she becomes the first Japanese national in New York State to become an American citizen. Pushes herself to the front of the line. That's a pretty good story, but it gets a little better. The TB Sanitarium had closed, and the buildings were repurposed as a veterans rest camp. There was no VA system yet. And so a lot of American GIs and other vets are on top of Mount McGregor here. And frankly, to be candid with you, I would think it would be a very good opportunity for a PTSD moment. If you're up here and you had fought the Japanese and you suddenly see a Japanese person wandering around, it might not be a good thing for you. For one American veteran, it was a great thing. He met Ca, I believe she was a volunteer there, and fell madly, head over heels in love with her. And she fell head over heels in love with him. And so, they married. Her maiden name, Ca Narita. I'm glad you're sitting down. Her married name, Mrs. Tony Gambino. Like the organized crime family, but no relation. He was 30 years old, she was 50. That's the reaction a lot of women have. I told this story in the Saratoga Library earlier this year, and a woman in the crowd went, "You go, girl!" In any case, Ca would live to be, she would die at 83 after living here for 70 years. It's 1984. A few months before her death, Governor Mario Cuomo gave her an award for all she had done to preserve the history of General Grant and Grant Cottage. But she passes away in 1984. The state's going to close Grant Cottage, and then the Friends of Grant Cottage got organized and talked the state out of it. As Ben told you, we're all volunteers here. And believe me, if you want to be a volunteer, this is a fun place to be a volunteer. Now, one of the founders of the Friends of Grant Cottage was Ellen DeLayla. She was at the meeting, or the talk I gave at the Saratoga Library, and she pulled me aside afterward and she said, "I have a little story to tell you. Ca had a lot of friends around here." She said, "I don't know if it was during the war or shortly after, but one of her friends, who told me the story, came up to visit Ca. And she walked in to the cottage kitchen, and there was CA talking with a young American GI in uniform. And that GI was Japanese. And Miss DeLayla said, my friend was shocked to see an American GI who was obviously Japanese. It was one of CA's nephews, I don't know which one, but I think it goes to a point that's important. The folks around here didn't see CA as any different from them. Yeah, she looked a little different, but it was no big deal. She was a friend. She was a teacher. She played organs in the churches around here. Her ethnicity for the locals had vanished. And I think that's really interesting. Really interesting. CA, incidentally, loved, there are legions of stories about her love for animals. She would leave food out all the time here. For the wild animals who even didn't need food. There's one story, she left some a food dish out here, I don't know, for the raccoons, maybe. And a deer came up on the porch here and ate the raccoon's food. And CA took the dish away and went into the kitchen, and the deer followed her into the kitchen looking for seconds and got them. And CA always had pets. She had a dog named Frosty and a cat named Dixie. And by all accounts, was one of the gentlest people you would ever meet. Now, no story is about one individual. I told you that CA essentially adopted her nieces, Frances and Nancy. I want to tell you a little bit about her nephew, Kenjiro. The United States government authorizes the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, going to be made up of Japanese Americans. They're not going to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. They're going to fight the Germans in Europe. These boys, and they were boys, felt they had to prove something about their loyalty to America and their patriotism. And they did. Now, I want to just give you some statistics about this regiment. In the end, the replacements would come in all during the war. The regiment originally, was about 4,000 men. But in the end, about 18,000 Japanese American young men would serve in the unit. 18,000. Here's the statistics. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was awarded 9,500 Purple Hearts, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 600 Silver Stars, and 23 Medals of Honor, and 7 Presidential Unit Citations. It became the most decorated military unit in American history. These young men had something to prove about their patriotism, and they did, through their blood. And CA's nephews were in that regiment. Now, Kenjiro enlisted when he was 19, went to school in Florida, and there's a little bit in his high school yearbook. I know he was a Boy Scout. He liked to hunt and fish. He was in the school's ROTC. And in yearbooks, they have wills where a graduating senior leaves something of himself to an undergraduate. Kenjiro, whose nickname was Kangaroo, and I don't know why, this is what he wrote. I, Kenjiro Yoshida, will my calm, quiet disposition to Bob Rossborough. I'm going to assume this is ironic. I willed, in my high school yearbook, my superior athletic skills. You're laughing, and you should, because I had none at all. It was meant to be ironic. So I am going to assume that when Kenjiro said he was calm and quiet, he was just the opposite, outgoing and gregarious. Okay. 442nd. By the way, I have a map here, and just to very quickly show you where the 442nd was. And I'll tell you in advance, this map is every bit as good as the maps I drew in the 5th grade. You recognize the boot of Italy, obviously. The Anzio campaign, south of Rome, began all right. The 442nd wasn't in it, but the Americans landed here, pushed inland a little ways, and then were stopped cold for months. Finally, they broke out. And the plan was to push from Anzio across the boot of Italy to cut off the German troops in the south. Partway across, the orders changed. Go north and liberate Rome, which meant all the Germans escaped, and that was a bad thing. But in any case, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team arrives to take part in the liberation of Rome and the fighting up along the western side of Italy. And they're going to fight their way through numerous small towns here. The one town you might know that they liberated was Pisa, with the Leaning Tower of Pisa. After they take part in the liberation of this section of Italy, they are sent to France to head up toward the border with Germany. And this is all in the regimental lore. I have the regiment's history book back there on the table and some images. The regiment will come up here to the Vosges forest. And they will immediately be confronted by tanks. This is infantry. They will fight for days, but eventually break through this wall of tanks. And then they are told, deep in this forest is an American battalion that is trapped. There was a lost battalion in World War I. There's a lost battalion in World War II in the Vosges forest. And the 442nd's task is to break through the 10 miles held by the Germans and rescue these fellow soldiers. It will take them 5 days to break through. They are undermanned. Each company should have 190 men. They actually average 81. The fighting is going to be beyond belief. In the end, these Japanese-American boys will break through, and they will rescue the lost battalion. They will rescue 211 men, and in the process sustain 800 casualties. You wonder where all those Purple Hearts came from. This is part of the regimental lore that they are most proud of. Now, as an aside, the battalion they saved was made up of Texans. And in 1962, Texas Governor John Conley, to recognize the Japanese Americans who had saved his fellow Texans, the governor of Texas issued a proclamation saying that all the survivors of the 442nd were now honorary Texans. All right, the fighting goes on there for a while, and then the regiment is pulled back to the coast of France. And they do a little skirmishing, but there's not a lot of action there. But one thing happens that, again, all the veterans of the regiment just love. And I have a photograph of it on the back table. They're looking out over this beautiful little bay. And a periscope comes up. And then a submarine. It is a 2-man German submarine. And smoke's billowing out of it. It's obviously having engine trouble. And the 2 men on board are trying to fight this little fire and get the heck out of there. And the Americans on the beach open fire on them. And the bullets are pinging off the sub. And finally these 2 German sailors just raise their hands, call it quits, beach the submarine. Far as I know, this is the only German submarine ever captured by American infantry. There was a naval base 10 or 12 miles away. The GIs towed the submarine to the naval base and dropped it off with no explanation. The Navy is still trying to figure out where this German mini-submarine came from. 442nd. Okay. They return to Italy and they fight along what was called the Gothic Line in northern Italy. And this will be where the war ends. Just a couple of things. At the end of the war, well, no, it wasn't at the end of the war. It was long after the war. In 2010, the United States Congress issued a Congressional Gold Medal to all the Japanese Americans who had served in the war. That medal shows the 442nd, the 100th Battalion, and it honors the Japanese Americans who worked in military intelligence. I've got photocopies of the medal back there. And in 2012, France honored the 442nd, the survivors, by declaring them chevaliers of the French Legion of Honor, which means all the survivors are now knights, French knights. The regiment gets home, 1946, and they are addressed on the White House lawn by President Truman. And he says this, among other things: Americanism is not a matter of race or creed. It is a matter of the heart. You fought not only the enemy, you fought against prejudice, and you have won. President Truman to the men of this regiment. Now, Kenjiro had been killed in action. He never heard President Truman's words, but he was killed in the fighting north of Rome, 1 year to the day after he enlisted. He was still 19 years old. His body was brought home, I believe, in 1947, and he now rests in a cemetery, I think in St. Cloud, Florida. So, I told you about Frances, age 93, coming here 2 months ago. She's on a tour bus with, 40 other people who don't know her story. And I embarrass her. I tell them her story and the story of Ca Narita, her aunt. And then I try to sum up what the veterans of the 442nd were trying to say to all of us. What they were trying to say was, it doesn't matter where your parents were born. You can still be a true and a good American. At which 93-year-old Frances pipes up, "That's right!" Still feisty after all these years. And I think that's about it. If you want more detail on her story, and all the caretakers, including the Andersonville survivor, I did write a little booklet about the caretakers.